supported the idea of Satan as a physical figure. Well, we see that in folklore, Satan is mainly used as a comic relief. An example of that is the last picture I've got on this slide, where we see St. Dunstan and Satan, and of course where St. Dunstan of course tricked the devil and pinched his nose. So Satan is presented not only as that kind of symbolism of cosmic evil, but also we see Satan as a kind of silly character that could be easily being tricked, especially by saints. Now the 1500s, of course, and with the change in terms of like the religious kind of clash, where we start with Catholicism and of course Protestantism, what we see is that, and of course the Renaissance movement, what we see is actually that Satan becomes more of a takes a more symbolic significance, and that pretty much suggesting the idea that evil is not external, as we believed before, but is something that lies within the human existence. Now, the most important, of course, let's say, I would say the contributor to Satan's fame, of course, has been John Milton and Paradise Lost. And although sometimes we tend to present Satan as the rebellious hero, and of course the let's say the example, the basic example for the creation of the romantic hero later on, what we see is actually, if we read between the lines and have a look at John Milton's own life, what we find out is that Milton actually was against the idea of rebellion. He sided with Cromwell and the parliamentarian system, and we used the idea of the rebellious Satan, of course, in order to deter people from of course rebelling against the English rule. One specific example, for instance, is the idea that Satan is been presented as evil, is presented as a person that wants to create chaos and destabilize order. And Milton's actual symbolism of his satanic character comes from the fact that there has been many there have been many let's say political messages throughout some travel writing and political narratives that mostly represented anything that had to do with Satan as a symbol of resistance. An example of that specifically is that Paradise Lost is actually a political discourse for the Irish Revolution, and particularly of 1649, and of course Cromwell's of Cromwell eventually overpowering the Irish. And there has been, as I said, a lot of correlation between Irish rebels and Irish people to demons. And there have been also many people that would suggest that the Irish are working for the devil. Of course, if we have to see that a little bit more with, let's say, the 21st century kind of perspective, knowing already the historical facts, is that, of course, Catholicism has been the villain, the enemy, the foil to the English Protestant hegemonic order. And of course, what we see later on, because there is, as I said before, there is that kind of correlation between Milton's Satan and the Romantic Satan. This is actually been done by William Godwin, whose reading of Milton's Satan began the more of sympathetic presentation of Satan and the eventual rehabilitation. Satan became the major character of many Romantic texts, and we see that especially in Byron's literature. The Romantic Satan is very different from the Satan we've seen in the medieval times, and that is because it becomes more of an anthropomorphic Satan, a Satan that has flaws, but at the same time, there is an understanding as to why he is rebelling. He's rebelling against order, he's rebelling against dominance, and he's presented as a symbol of freedom in most of Romantic literature. And here we come now from all this background to see how the Satanic is actually being utilized within in the other side, which is the colonized. Because as I said, Satan is a developing and evolving character. What we see is that it can be used and changed in order to fit certain narratives and purposes. And in this case, one of the major, for me, and my favorite, actually, Irish writer, Charles Maturin, created a parallel narrative to that of Milton's, but this time from the Irish perspective rather than the English perspective. And we see that in Melmoth the Wanderer. To begin with, Melmoth, of course, is not Irish. Maturin himself wasn't Irish, he was Anglo-Irish. His family, of course, moved over to Ireland, and they were given power because of the Anglo-Irish rule, sort of the English rule in Ireland. Melmoth in the text is actually presented as the English Faust or Satan. He's called the Englishman by people that don't know his real name. And what is quite characteristic is that Melmoth is a master of history. Charles Maturin is a master of history. Therefore, Melmoth has a deep political and historical significance. Maturin places the moment of temptation during the years of the Cromwellian occupation, certainly saying that Melmoth's brother was part of Cromwell's army. And of course, the pact happens at the moment where Cromwell and his army invades Ireland and occupies Ireland. And the kind of extended life, that extended kind of contract, is a symbol of England's extended hegemony over Ireland. And although we could potentially say that as an Anglo-Irish, he shouldn't be against the English rule, in reality is that most of the Anglo-Irish writers, such as Maturin, as we will see later on, Sheridan Le Fanu, what they've experienced, especially in the 19th century, is that the pact between England and Ireland, of course, it was all based on false hope, because Ireland's economy, especially towards the end of the 18th century and in the long 19th century, has been impacted by that. Irish people were living in poverty. There was a lot of discrimination when it comes to the classes. The Anglo-Irish themselves also felt quite isolated, and they couldn't feel that they could fit in. And what I mean by that is that for the Irish, they were deemed as the occupier, and for the English, they were considered as the colonized. So it was difficult for them to find a way to fit in within the Irish society, but at the same time, they were quite vocal when it comes to their political messages and the realities that they experienced in Ireland. Now, of course, Melmoth is a very problematic character because we can't actually say that he's a Satan. If he's a Satan, he shouldn't have a pact with a Satan. So why is there this kind of correlation between the Faustian and the Satanic character? And I think, as based on my research, I think this has been done quite purposefully, and that is because Faust gives more the idea of the victimizer, where we feel the Anglo-Irish as a kind of outcasts by both the Irish society and the English society, but the Satan then allows him to get the idea of the victimizer, the perpetrator, which most of the Anglo-Irish writers felt. They felt the guilt and the burden for what they committed against the local Irish. Now, and the justification as to why Melmoth is both a Faust but also Satan is because we see a lot of these Miltonic allusions within the text. Some of the quotes that I've chosen, Melmoth says, "None can participate in my destiny, but with his own consent. No one have consented. None can be involved in its tremendous penalties, but participation, which actually echoes the Miltonic Satan's lament and regret for his rebellion against God, when especially he says, which way I fly is hell, myself I am hell. So the kind of point of reflection that we see in both characters, of course, for completely different reasons. Another allusion is the reason why, of course, both characters fell. And in both cases, we see that the idea of pride and intellectual glorying is the idea of freedom of thinking, which, of course, as Milton suggested, this is the reason why Satan decided to oppose God. And the end, let's say the punishment for both characters, we see that there is a hellish imagery that is very parallel in both texts. In the first case, Melmoth, at the end of the book, he's been cast in the fiery ocean, and in the same case we see that in Paradise Lost that Satan, of course, is cast in the fiery gulf. And of course, this kind of allusions create a type of dialogue between Charles Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer and Milton's Paradise Lost. And I could even take it a little bit further, suggesting that kind of reworking of Paradise Lost in Melmoth the Wanderer. But this time, as I said before, from a different viewpoint, from the aspect of the colonized rather than the colonizer. And we see that Melmoth the Wanderer is actually a deeply political and historical text, because we see a lot of that, the idea of colonialism and gender politics, especially when it comes to the characters of Immalee and Melmoth. Of course, Immalee is an outcast, but she lives alone. She has this kind of characteristics of exoticism. She has no touch with the rest of the world. She's quite naive. Is the character of the noble savage, as we see a lot in literature. The idea of the island, and Immalee, of course, resembles a lot Ireland. The wilderness that the island has resembles the purity, natural purity and wilderness of Ireland. In the same case, of course, Immalee, we could say that is the female that is invaded by Melmoth, who comes and tries to tempt her. And in this kind of imagery, this kind of description, what we've got is a deeply political meaning, which is, of course, Melmoth as the Englishman comes to an island and tries to tempt an innocent girl. In the colonial narrative, especially the hegemonic narrative, is quite stereotypical that the colonizer will be classed as a man, as a male, and the colonized, of course, as a female. And with this kind of like gender relations, we also see that they're being implemented in the colonial thought. Melmoth invades, of course, like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, in Emily's world. And what we see is that Immalee, of course, is resisting that kind of temptation, which is very different to the way that the Immalee's counterpart in Milton's Paradise Lost is behaving towards Satan. Even Paradise Lost is presented as a character that is tempted by Satan. It's very easy for her to work with him. However, we see Immalee is armed with her purity and rejects Melmoth's approaches. And of course, this kind of resistance to temptation is more of an understanding potentially for Maturin, going back in history and understanding why the Irish were opposing the English rule. And that is, of course, because they wanted their freedom. And of course, because the English, as Maturin suggests, is a Satan that comes to tempt. Now, and that, of course, takes us to the next very famous writer, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Although the difference between the two writers is only 10 years, Le Fanu has been heavily influenced by the revival of the Irish folklore. And although we see that Maturin's text has more of the Gothic and romantic kind of influences, Lefano's stories change and they focus more on the folkloric aspect. Most of his short stories, of course, are based in folklore, and his utilization of Satan, of course, although it's not different from Maturin's, because they both suggest that Satan is a stranger that invades, is a little bit different in terms of the way that is being presented. We don't see Satan as that kind of rebel, the sympathetic heroes we see with Melmoth at times, especially the moments where he's reflecting and trying to escape his destiny and regret, and of course the feeling of regret, whereas the Satan in Lefano's fiction is more of the folkloric Satan, the Satan that comes to tempt and punish, especially those greedy. And in this case, in Sheridan Le Fanu's fiction, what we see is the utilization of nature that in some way correlates with Satan. And specifically, we're going to talk about the two main texts that we will discuss about today. The one is The Fortunes of Sir Robert Arder, and the rework of this story around 30, 40 years later, which is Sir Dominic's Bargain. And we're going to see what is the significance in the correlation between the Sylvan landscape, the Sylvan Irish landscape, and of course Satan. And to begin with, of course, what we need to think about is the significance of the forest, which has been essential to the Irish paganistic past. Ireland was quite famous, especially in the Middle Ages, for the purity of nature and of course the woods. However, with the invasion of Ireland, most of these woods were cut down, and Sheridan Le Fanu in the mid-19th century could see the deterioration of this Irish landscape. And because Ireland's past was a paganistic past, the woods were sacred for the local people. But with the advent of Christianity, the focus changed from the admiration of nature and worship of nature to the admiration of humans and putting humans in the center. And in this kind of Christian thought, the wood became more of a site of fear and the supernatural, of the paganistic, of the savage past, of course, that needs to be eradicated. But at the same time, though, it had flourished in the Irish folklore, and the forest became a symbol of a nation resisting subjugation, a past that is resisting to of course being eradicated by the present. Some notable Irish devil legends, of course, is the two-rooted briar, Larry and the Devil, Jack-o'-lantern, which I think the majority of us are acquainted with, and Sean O'Doin and the Devil. Now, thinking about the two texts, what we see is that, of course, Sheridan Le Fanu is utilizing the same idea that Maturin had, and that is the fact that Satan is presenting as the stranger. Although so in Melmoth we see that the stranger is actually the English. In both of these stories, the stranger has French origins, is a Frenchman. Now, the use of the word Jack, of course, as we see in both cases, in the case of Sir Robert Arder, of course, is quite of an Irish folkloric name that was used for Satan. The reason why he is French is because during the 18th century, where most of these stories are set, the French were trying to appeal to the local Irish to join them in and fight against the English. So the idea of the stranger is more the idea of the foreign kind of interference in Ireland's politics. Now, the temptation and of course the pact become then examples of an invited invasion. Both of these characters invite the devil to have a pact, because in the first case of Sir Robert Arder, because he's greedy and he wants to constantly win when he gambles. And in the second story, Sir Robert Arder, what we see is that he is going to the woods, to the forests, in order to find a solution to his financial state. Now, the Irish Sylvan space in both tales, though, seems that it's being invaded firstly by the ruling class. In the case of Sir Robert Arder, we see that the Arders destroyed the majority of the forest in order to build their castle. And in the case of Sir Dominic's bargain, of course, what we see is that he enters the forest in order to find a solution. And of course, as a result, this kind of invasion is being then retaliated when in both cases, Satan invades their own space, their own house, which of course in a more symbolic way could be the house of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, the big house as we call, in order to punish both characters. In Sir Dominic's tale, of course, what we see is that the entrance into the Moura woods is not only an example of invited invasion, but it is also, in a more personal level, we can say an invasion into the dark recesses of Sir Dominic's mind. And in those dark recesses, of course, what we see is that Sir Dominic, which in the story earlier we see he participated in the fight against the English, so he was in support of the French. Of course, this went to no avail because he did not earn any money for that. He did not care for his estate. In this kind of dark mind, what we see, dark part of his mind, is Sir Dominic in utter desperation, potentially reflection, going back to all the decisions that he has made that of course led to the destruction of his family. In both of these stories, of course, the devil in the woods has the kind of, as I say, the cyclical perspective of unsolved and ongoing political issues. There is a vicious circle of invasion, of possession and dispossession that we see in both of the stories, which of course, for Lefanu, another Anglo-Irish writer, that he was heavily involved in the politics. We see that he is challenging and rethinking his position within the Irish politics and the Irish society. The reworking of the story, because when I first started reading them, was like, why would you rewrite a story? What is the purpose? It's quite interesting that Sir Robert Arder is written in the beginning of his career, whereas Sir Dominic's bargain at the end of his career. And at the end of Lefanu's career, he was quite disappointed and felt that he has been disillusioned by the whole support of the Tory party and of course of England, because he experienced a life where, as an Anglo-Irish, he never got the support from his own caste. The final part of the presentation is going to be about the significance and connection between Satan and another aspect of nature, which is the sea and the water, which from my research, I have found that it comes from a more biblical influence, especially in the Old Testament, where God created the sea. He cast all the monsters in the depths of that sea. Leviathan is actually considered to be the precursor of Satan in the Old Testament. Sometimes as well, we see that there is a parallel between Satan and Leviathan, the idea of the monster and the dragon in the sea. Charlotte Riddell, of course, another Irish writer who is, although she hasn't stayed in Ireland for the majority of her life, but actually she was living in London. And we could accept some kind of distance from the political narrative. In reality, we see in some of her short stories that the devil is a stranger again, is a permanent figure, adopting the same kind of symbolism that the Satan had for Matrin and Lefanu. In order to understand the connection between Satan and the sea, what we see is that there is a difference in religious thought between the idea of surface and, of course, the depth of the sea. The surface is the known, the surface is what is safe, whereas the deep is the unknown, and where most of the monsters are lurking. Now, the idea of the surface and the depth, of course, is quite significant, because from biblical times, then we could say that Satan is cast in the sea. Leviathan is cast in the sea. We see in Dante Alighieri's, of course, that Satan is cast in a frozen lake. Later on, Milton, of course, takes the same kind of idea where he casts Satan into the fiery gulf. And the kind of connection between the sea and Satan, I would say, in my view, is mainly because of the unknown, of the scary aspect of the depth, and the unknown and scary aspect of the representation of evil. In colonial discourse now, the sea is becoming the medium of subjugation, especially when it comes to Irish politics. It is through the sea that the subjugation of Ireland happens. And in this case, in what we see is that although the sea is the medium, what becomes quite clear, and especially in Riddell's stories, is that the sea is the place where the colonizer arrives, but it is the coast that becomes let's say, the no man's land. And it is through the coast that this kind of subjugation begins. The littoral zones, in the case of Ennismore, of course, is the coast. In the case of Sandy the Tinker, is the riverbank. They become in between spaces between two worlds, and of course in a more colonial aspect. These two worlds, are the colonizer and the colonized. And becomes as well the first point of intrusion for Satan. In the case of Ennismore, Satan is found walking on the coast, and then the squire invites him into his house. And when they finish with the brandy, they move back to the sea, and the squire is killed by the devil. Specifically towards the end, we see that the stranger on the coast is actually Satan, because we see it says in the text, one walking over the sand saw the print of a cloven foot that he tracked to the water's edge. Then everybody knew where the squire had gone and with whom. And of course, in Sandy the Tinker, the priest finds the devil in the riverbank, and the stone on the riverbank become the gates of hell. In these cases, what we see is that both the squire, but also in Sandy the Tinker, we see that there is a first point of invasion that happens from those characters, from the squire and the priest. The squire, because of his greed, suggesting that he owns the whole of the land, possessing the land, suggesting that the land is his own, and of course the priest, that it invades the natural space, and of course it tries to invade the riverbank, which is the place where Satan lies. It is, in my view, I feel that in the long 19th century, the Satanic has been through a lot of transformations, and the way that it was utilized by those writers of course, from the perspective of the colonized, allow them to change this kind of discourse that actually the colonized are the satanic characters, the threats to the imperial England, and to show in reality that it was England's advances and colonial strategy and of course violence that has made them become the Satans, make them of course the invaders in this case. Katrina, can you hear me?
Are you frozen? Hello?
Hello, now I can hear you. Sorry.
Good.
Excellent. So it would be nice, I think, if we discuss about that a little bit further. I know I was a little bit quick and I apologize for that. I guess is the stress. So what would you like us to do now?